Jason here with me today, and we are doing, this is the first module of Clean Up Your Act. And the reason I wanted to run this program now is because it's the start of the new year. And so lots of people are thinking about cleaning up their act in all sorts of different ways. And I wanted to reach out to Jason because he's a specialist in the area of addiction. And I think I know very little about addiction, but I might find out I know more than I think I do. And so for me, like, we might think about addiction to drugs or pornography or shopping or sex, but it can be, in my mind, it's the everyday things like being addicted to your phone, to Facebook, to checking how many likes you're getting on Instagram, to working too much, to smoking, to, addicted to exercise. Like, there's a whole different range of addictions. And my guess is that some of you are here today and thinking about trying to change some of your behaviors that you might consider might be addictions more than you might have realized. And so Jason is the person that I've invited to speak to us about this so that we can get a fresh perspective, I guess, on the topic of addiction. So Jason, firstly, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And I'd love it if you just share a little bit of your personal background, like why this is a topic that's dear to your heart.
Yeah. I mean, long before I found this understanding, I mean, ever since I could remember, addiction was a thing in my life. Like one of my earliest memories as a child after the loss of my dad was that there was this argument in our house about who's eaten. And it was like, who's eating this, and it was kind of like, and I remember being excited about being able to eat food when my mum left me at home on my own. And I remember that feeling of excitement, thinking, oh my God, yeah, there's cakes in the fridge, or there's hot chocolate that I can, and all these, like, having this excitement, and I suffered with eating disorders for most of my life, but I remember that, right back as early as I can remember. And then going through the whole spectrum of addictions, to the point of spending many months, many years in jail, like for committing crimes to feed my addiction to drugs and alcohol and crime and crazy stuff. In the middle of it, I starting off with food, and I wouldn't necessarily say ending up with food, but like definitely after drugs, coming away from drugs and alcohol through just being totally sick and tired of living that life, going back to food, like picking up food again. And then like going on this journey of trying to wonder what was going on. Well, how come I can't stop doing this? I've stopped taking drugs and alcohol. I've been to therapy for a long time. I trained as a therapist. I went to all the Tony Robbins events. I trained in multiple modalities of therapy. I trained in CBT. I trained in psychodynamic. I trained in NLP. I did all these person-centered approach. I did the Hoffman process. I did Landmark. I did all these silent meditations and all these things. And it was like, but literally I was just still doing things against my will that I didn't want to do. I was still eating against my will. I was going on diets against my will. I was going to the gym obsessively against my will to try and offset the diets that weren't working. And I was, I had struggles with relationships and money and different things. And it's like, I really just used to sit down and think, what is wrong with me? I just can't stop doing these things. And it was kind of like, so that's pretty much in a nutshell, like how it had been, my whole life, really. Even being in recovery, so-called 12-step recovery for over 2 decades, being a qualified therapist, working with addictions in the field from my understanding at that time, still really, if you got down to it with me, I was still struggling with it while trying to help other people, so, and I guess I thought I knew everything at that time, but for some reason I really thought I was broken.
Right. Even though you kind of had come out the other side of it, there was still all the behaviors, you'd come out of the other side of it, you're actually helping other people with it, but in the meantime, in the background, the same, like, behaviors, they're just taking a different form, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just a different form, and they become more subtle and more, more like socially acceptable. Let's say that, it's kind of like, I'm not committing crime anymore, or falling around drunk or not showing up for appointments and things like that. I've got an external life, I've got a business, I've got a career, so to speak, but really, the deep seated, what looked like the real deep psychological pain, trauma, struggles, those things that kind of like were never overcome, seemed to be the cause of the problems that I was having. So it was more socially acceptable in food, in diet and things like that. But if you really sat down with me in a room on a one-to-one and I poured my heart out, I'd have said I was suffering,
Mm. And is that what often happens? I know today we're going to talk a bit more about the symptoms, like what are the symptoms? But is that what I'm just curious, is that tends to be what happens, is that it just, there's some kind of, and we can talk about what actually addiction is, but it just changes form over the period of somebody's life. So you might move from smoking to drugs to alcohol to exercise to food but it just keeps taking different form. Is that typical?
It's common for many people, many people who have drug addictions will have been to the severe, or the extreme, you might say, from a symptomatic point of view, like their symptoms were like they were taking, excessive amount of drugs or drinking alcohol to the point of oblivion, and so on and stuff like that. When they stop, they will start something else. They were often, it's so funny. I used to joke about it, not funny, but like the weight that people would gain, in traditional recovery, that they would turn up like after years of drug addiction, like 8 stone guys, like 6 foot and 8 stone, like skinny as anything. And within a year, you'd meet them again and they'd be like 17 stone, and it was kind of like that. And all that would go on like almost out of their conscious awareness, that it's kind of like it just transfer from, and that's what I did, I just transferred from one thing to another. And I just saw that happen with so many people, and they would pick up gambling and relationships and all the other things. So it's very common, there's not a uniform answer to everyone because everyone's so unique, but very common that happens with people. So some more subtle than others, but in some more obvious,
Yeah. And so tell us, this module is called like It's Not About the Symptoms. So say a little bit more about that. Like what are the symptoms? Why is it not about the symptoms?
Well, it's funny because the symptoms, have become the problem, and then the problem has become the reason for the symptoms, in traditional understanding. And I get a little bit confused saying this, so I have to slow down. But
give me an example. Hang on a minute. I can feel my mind go, say it again, but slowly, and then give me an example.
So the symptoms are the behavior, they are the symptoms. They're not the problem, right? So whatever I'm doing, whether I'm drinking alcohol, taking drugs, going on diets, whatever it is, they're the symptoms of the problem. They're not the problem. But like in a traditional understanding, it becomes about the symptoms. So everyone gets fixated on, I've got an addiction, I've got a drug addiction, I've got an eating disorder, so on. And then that becomes the problem and the reason for the symptoms, so it's kind of like, I'm doing all these things because I've got an eating disorder. I'm doing all these things because I've got I take drugs because I'm a drug addict. That's what I do. It's kind of like, so like making it a bit clearer, if you go to the psychiatric, the actual diagnosis from a mental health point of view, like how the diagnoses came about, how the actual, that a group of people sat around in a room and said, I think that if somebody's been doing this for 6 months of their life and the severity's been this bad, then they should have this diagnosis. And someone else has said, no, it's not that bad. It's got to be worse than that, and they've all had this kind of debate where they've come up with this list of things and they said, right, if somebody identifies with 6 out of this 9 list, then they've got it. It's kind of like, and because this is like the Bible of mental health, the DSM or the ICD, the actual book that psychiatrists go to see if somebody's got, this thing that they call substance use disorder in the relation of drugs. That because it's practiced by medical doctors, people seem to come to the conclusion that it's fact, that it's just what it is, and they don't realize the subjectivity of the diagnosis, how people are come up with. So like people are typically conditioned to just think that it's some big thing, addiction, or anything that's got a diagnosis, as you know about, with your subject, that that is unexplainable, that's really big and beyond everyone, and it can only be understood by medical doctors. And if you've got it, this is the results of what happens. So when I say it's not about the symptoms, it's really about that. It's like that everyone has become so fixated and conditioned into the idea that, like, if you have this thing that you've been diagnosed with, whatever the name of it is, whether it ranging from general anxiety disorder, pathological gambling, substance use disorder, all those names that are in that book, it's kind of like that you become focused on that as the problem, but it's not about that. That is a symptom, of the problem, and that's where the misunderstanding starts, with addiction, just about what it's really about. And it's common, it's normal, for people. I was always looking for help with whether it was drug addiction. I went to rehab, when I was struggling with different things. I was trying to moderate behaviors. I was always looking at the level of behavior, what you said, to fix it. And it was like, never did it occur to me, or never did I look deeper than that, to see, apart from looking like as if it was something to do with my past, because I'd had trauma, because I'd had an unavailable parent, all the things that I learned in psychodynamic sort of therapy approach to working with addiction. So it always, and all those typical psychological treatments perpetuate the idea about it being about the behavior, because they give techniques and tools and ways of coping with the problem that you've got. And they also take, in many ways, will take you back into the past to try and resolve what it is, what's causing it, from there. So it just keeps you looking in the wrong direction, I guess, is the main point of that.
Yeah, well, I guess when you're saying that, I'm thinking, so where you're talking your experiences with the, I don't know, the more serious, right, the more dramatic, if you like, what we often think about addiction, and I'm kind of, I guess, playing devil's advocate by looking at the milder end, right, like addiction to social media, right?
Yeah.
And so what you're saying there is that we don't get diagnosed with you're a social media addict, right, yet. Anyway, but what you're saying is that what we look at is we see our flicking on our phone constantly, and then so now I need to find a way to stop flicking on my phone, as if that's the problem.
Yeah.
Right. And so now I'm going to try and, in my case, just out myself, like putting like screen blockers on my phone, or like having strategies to plug it in a different room, or trying to wean myself off it and feeling the pull to just one more swipe and all that kind of thing. But you're treating the behavior as if it's the problem, because that's the thing we can see.
Yeah.
Right? We see the empty wine bottles going out into the bin. We see the criminal behavior. We see the like that we can see on our phone how many times we picked it up today, because it will tell us if we look. And then we go to that and say, well, that's the problem. I need to stop that behavior. And if I stop that behavior, then I'd be okay.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're saying. It's so if it's not about that, what is it?
I mean,
we're saying like that's the wrong direction. That's not a very helpful direction. But like, what's the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, like, the interesting thing is that, I mean, that is true what you're saying, that kind of like, even in the stuff where you're not going to go to rehabilitation for looking at your phone, for example, it's kind of like, or even with eating, there's degrees of variation to what people suffer, like some people eat too much, feel a bit bad, don't do it. Some people cannot stop feeding their face with food and cakes that they feel suicidal about, devastating in that way. So it's kind of like there's degrees in each thing. But what I've seen is that when like what we're actually doing is escaping from the reality of life that we've got, from the reality of life that we're creating in our mind, from the idea of suffering, from there's usually one, I describe it like this, that there's usually like there's who I am and who I think I should be, so it's kind of like there's that misunderstanding going on for people. So there's always like the idea of a gap you know, between when I get to here, then I'll be okay. Now, it's not always like totally conscious, this sort of like, oh, I know that I think I'm here, and I think when I get to here, I'll be okay. So what I'll do is I'll scroll on my phone too much in between till I get here. You know, it's not, it just doesn't work like that. You know, it's just, it's really become a conditioned and a learned way of coping with feelings and thoughts that we have about ourselves that we're creating in the mind, you know, that are not really true. So there's that gap that tries to be bridged. And there's also the idea of like how the world looks to me and how I think it should be, you know, and there's kind of like, and when I get to here, you know, like when I get from where I think I am and where I think I need to be, like that could be on the external, you know, like when I get the right job, when I get the right life, when I fix my relationship, when I lose weight, when my family speaks to me again. I mean, that list is endless, you know, and they're so subtle and often so that what I'm talking about is really unconscious or subconscious for many people, that there's no real obvious thing in my life that's a real red flag. And if this thing was fixed, then I would stop eating cake or scrolling on my phone. It's kind of like that. It really can be so subtle that I could ask many people and they'll say, oh no, my life's really good. You know, it seems okay. But then when you start getting to know them and digging into it and kind of like, they'll go, well, there is this one thing, you know, and it's kind of like, and everyone has that one thing, right?
Yeah. And so when we're looking at that, then, so what you're saying there is not that there's this idea, let's go back to the first one. So there's me here, and then there's this idea of who I should be, right? Like the upgraded version, right? So I like to think about it as like the upgraded version of me that always, you know, looks great, eats the right food, does the right exercise, all the rest of it, right? And I never live up to, well, it's not a huge distance, but it's just a little bit more, right? Just a little bit more exercise, just a little bit less weight, just a little bit more money, right? Like it's just, that's why it's so subtle, right? But it's but it isn't that part of that upgraded me. I'm not aspiring to, that upgraded me isn't one that drinks too much wine or flicks on her phone or takes drugs or anything. It's not that I'm trying to become that upgraded version of me that leads me to drink or flick on my phone, right? I guess what you're saying is it's a way of coping with that feeling of the gap, of the lack, right? So when we're sitting in a feeling of lack, to my mind, it's like, I guess, just thinking back to my smoking days, or my working too hard days, or my flicking on my phone moments, or the other numerous things I could describe. But it feels like when I came to this conversation, I remember saying to the person I was working with at the time, like, it feels like there's a hole in my soul, and I don't know how to fill it, and so I would work really hard. And that's kind of like, I didn't even know what the upgraded version of me was, although I was really into personal development at the time, so I probably could have put it on a vision board and you know, made it, you know, showed you the lifestyle that I would have and all the rest of it. Now I come to think about it, but that was the feeling. It was like there was that feeling of wanting a cigarette. It felt like there was literally a vacuous hole in my body that needed nicotine to fill it, and then it would be like temporarily sealed over for a bit, and then the hole would open up again and there'd be nicotine, and then the nicotine would bring me back to normal. And that what you're saying is that feeling of gap, that just one more, you know, little addictive voice, but like that gap that opens up, that we grab something to fill it with. How you're describing that is that either that we have an idea that if we upgraded ourselves, or if we upgraded or something in our environment would change, then we wouldn't have that feeling of lack that needs to be filled with whatever substance looks like it makes no sense, I guess. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it definitely doesn't make any sense when you break it down, for sure. And that feeling of lack, you know, that, I guess, what I used to call a spiritual void, you know, it's kind of like that can't be filled with anything from outside of ourselves, and any idea, you know, any place that we can get to, or any set of circumstances that we can get outside. But you know, that's when you break it down, that's what it is. But that feeling can range from feeling a little bit of lack about something and a longing, you know, or it can be that my life's a total disaster, you know, and it's kind of like I may as well end it, you know. It's kind of like that's how far it can range from, you know, anywhere and anywhere in between. And it can be about one thing, or it can be about many things. It can be about everything, you know. It's like different people have different variations of really, you know, how, you know, the perspective, you know, overthinking basically, you know, the perspective that they create of the life that they have, you know.
Yeah, yeah, no, I see that. So what we're saying here is that to look at what our temptation is to look at what it is that we use to fill the gap, rather than why is there a gap? Is that, that's what you're saying? And that's why it's not about the symptoms. It's like, who cares what you stuff you stuff cakes in it, you stuff cigarettes in it, you stuff alcohol in it, you stuff Facebook in it, whatever. Like, we're not so fussed about that. We're looking at what is this gap that you're attempting to stuff, rather than what is it that you're stuffing it with, and can you just stop it, please?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of like a change in direction, isn't it? You know, and where we're looking, because and that is a difficult for you and me. Maybe it's easy to just say now and look, change directions in where we would look, and we could have that conversation. But for many people, that's kind of like, you know, so alien, you know, because they're so conditioned to keep looking, and they go back, you know, and they even if they get a glimpse of, you know, they go back to looking in that direction. And they, like, as you know, because like you're saying about putting blockers on your phone and stuff, you know, in the same way that I do with, you know, what can I think of, you know, with exercise, you know, and things like that. It's kind of like it's the same thing, you know. It's kind of like that we're just so conditioned, and even when we see what it is we're pointing at here, you know, like where we're going to be getting to in this conversation, it's like you've still got residual conditioning that kind of like turns your head back, you know, in the other way. So it's not like a, oh right, okay, yeah, now I know where to look type of thing. It's kind of like, you know.
No, I was talking to, as I was recording one of the courses in this Deep Peace of Mind with Erica Bugby, and we were talking about how you just, as a result of what we're going to talk about, and we'll dive deeper into that in next week, in the next week's module, but what happens as a result of this understanding is you graduate to different blind spots. That's all that happens. It's not like you get to a place where there are no blind spots. Is that you graduate to a different level of blind spots. So where you might have been committing crimes to be able to feed your addiction in the past, now you're excessively exercising, for example, or where I would work really, really hard all of the time. Like now I used to be totally addicted to certain trains of thought like that. That's what my anxiety was. That's what anxiety is, I guess, for a lot of people. It's just addicted to the what if thinking. I could not put it down, just had to keep picking it up to try and reassure myself. Like the idea of having, you know, an empty mind was terrifying. And so I'd stuff it with my I'd stuff the hole with my habitual thinking, right? So I don't do that anymore. But now I think that I need to cut down on my Facebook use, you know. It's like, it just is a different quality of problem. So that it's always going in the direction of health, which is what I love. So it's not that we clean up our act and then that's it. We become ta-da, you've become the upgraded version that you always wish you were.
Yeah.
It's something other than that we're pointing to, which we'll go on and cover. But it's just, I think today it's just really helpful for us to be able to point to the fact that as tempting as it is to look at the behavior, there's a different place to look.
Absolutely. Yeah.